There are evenings when the silence inside a house becomes so complete, so carefully arranged around provisionov and predictable movements, that it begins to feel less like comfort and more like a thin layer of glass stretched over deep water. And I remember thinking about that fragility on the night everything in my life quietly started to change. Although at the time, I could not yet name the reason for the unease that kept shifting in my chest like furniture being rearranged in the dark. I was standing at the kitchen sink, watching the reflection of the hanging lamp tremble in the black square of the window, aware of the faint mineral smell of hot water and the steady pressure of the plate against my palm. When I felt the peculiar sensation that I had been living on automatic for years, performing the duties of a husband the way a well-trained actor repeats lines long after the audience has forgotten the play. The refrigerator hummed behind me with its loyal mechanical patience. The clock above the doorway marked time with a disciplined, almost moral persistence, and somewhere upstairs a floorboard released a soft complaint as the temperature shifted, reminding me that houses, like people, speak most honestly when they believe no one is listening. My name is Philip. I am 52 years old, and for 24 of those years I had been married to a woman named Eloise, whose presence in my life had once arrived like weather, unexpected, intoxicating, impossible to ignore, but had gradually settled into something milder and more distant, like a season that repeats itself so faithfully you stop looking out the window to confirm it is still there. I worked as a regional logistics manager for a medical supply company, a job that required attention, reliability, and the quiet endurance of routine, and by the time I came home each evening, I often felt as though my interior life had been filed down into smooth, manageable edges. Eloise and I had mastered the art of peaceful coexistence, the expertise of people who no longer wished to wound each other, but had also stopped knowing how to reach each other. And in that careful neutrality, we moved through our days with the politeness of diplomats representing countries that had once been at war, but now preferred trade agreements to passion. We discussed grocery lists, upcoming repairs, the neighbor's new fence, the dull ache in my shoulder that returned with changes in the weather, and occasionally, in rare and almost ceremonial moments, we spoke about memories from long ago, which she handled with a tenderness that sometimes made me wonder whether the past had become her true residence, while the present functioned merely as a mailing address. That night, she was in the living room, her legs tucked beneath her on the couch, the lamplight brushing gold into her hair while the television murmured without conviction. And I remember how peaceful she looked from the doorway, how composed, how utterly at home inside the life we had built, and how that image would later return to me with a cruelty I could never have anticipated. At that moment, however, I was simply a husband finishing the dishes, aware of a mild fatigue behind my eyes and the ordinary hope that the rest of the evening would pass in the gentle, uneventful manner to which I had grown accustomed, never suspecting that stability could decay long before it collapses, and that sometimes betrayal begins not with dramatic gestures, but with the almost invisible reawakening of something that had been waiting patiently for decades to be invited back inside. The phone vibrated on the coffee table with a soft, insistent tremor that did not belong to the soundtrack of the muted television. And although the sound itself was unremarkable, barely louder than the settling of wood in the walls, I noticed immediately the way Eloise's body responded to it before her mind seemed to catch up, as if some older instinct had reached the surface first and tightened its grip around her spine. She did not look at me, even though I was standing only a few steps away, close enough to see the faint crease between her eyebrows deepen for a fraction of a second, and instead she leaned forward with a quickness that felt strangely out of character, reaching for the phone and angling the screen toward herself in a manner that was subtle enough to appear accidental, but deliberate enough to leave a small, unmistakable impression in my awareness. The lamplight reflected briefly off the glass, casting a pale stripe across her cheek, and I saw her lips part as she read whatever had appeared there, her breath catching in a way that suggested recognition rather than surprise. For a moment, she simply sat there, holding the phone loosely in her hand, her thumb hovering without moving, and I became uncomfortably aware of the silence that had gathered around us, the television continuing to speak into a room that was no longer listening. the clock marking seconds that suddenly felt heavier, more densely packed with meaning than they had been before. When she finally began typing, her movements were fluid and practiced, and I realized with a faint, unwelcome chill that this was not her first reply of the evening, nor was it likely to be her last. At this stage, Philip experiences the first subtle dissonance between his perception of marital stability and the emerging cues of secrecy. Psychologically, his attention to minor deviations, the pause in Eloise's actions, the guarded handling of the phone, illustrates the onset of hypervigilance, a common response when trust begins to erode. Emotionally, he oscillates between rationalization and suspicion, attempting to maintain cognitive consonance while subconsciously collecting evidence of a potential betrayal. Interpersonally, this moment reflects the fragility of trust in long-term relationships. Even minor inconsistencies can trigger profound anxiety when intimacy has been routine rather than emotionally engaged. The analysis here underscores that betrayal often begins with subtle behavioral cues and the emotional cost of denying them, highlighting the early tension between denial and intuitive awareness. I asked who it was in a voice that I barely recognized as my own. Because it carried no accusation and no real curiosity, only the polite cadence of someone who believed the answer would fit neatly into the world he already understood, and she smiled in response, though the smile seemed aimed slightly inward, as if it were meant to reassure herself more than me. "It's someone I went to school with," she said, glancing up briefly before returning her attention to the screen, and the words themselves were harmless enough, ordinary even, yet they landed with a peculiar weight that lingered in the air between us, because they gestured toward a time in her life I had never truly belonged to, a sealed-off landscape of corridors and lockers and early dreams where I existed only as an eventual stranger. I nodded, because nodding had become one of my most reliable habits, a physical expression of my long-standing belief that trust was maintained not through vigilance, but through restraint, and I told myself that there was nothing unusual about reconnecting with the past, that people my age did it all the time when the present began to feel repetitive and thin. Still, as Eloise stood and carried her phone with her into the hallway, excusing herself with a lightness that felt carefully balanced, I noticed that she did not leave it on the table the way she usually did, nor did she set it down on the counter when she paused to pour herself a glass of water, and these small deviations, insignificant on their own, began to arrange themselves in my mind like pieces of a picture I was not yet ready to see. When she returned, she sat farther from me on the couch than she had earlier, angling her body slightly away while pretending to focus on the television, and I found myself studying the familiar curve of her profile with an intensity that bordered on discomfort, searching for signs of change in the woman I had lived beside for nearly a quarter of a century. Her face looked the same. Her hair still carried the faint scent of the lavender shampoo she had used for years, and yet there was an alertness beneath her calm that I could not remember seeing before, a quiet hum of attention directed somewhere beyond the room we shared. Later that night, as we moved through the well-rehearsed routine of turning off lights and locking doors, Eloise took her phone with her into the bedroom and placed it face down on the nightstand, close enough that she could reach it without stretching, and although she said nothing about it, the gesture stayed with me as I lay awake beside her, listening to the rhythm of her breathing gradually slow while my own refused to settle. In the darkness, the ceiling above us seemed farther away than usual, as if the room had subtly expanded to accommodate an absence that had not yet fully revealed itself, and I lay there tracing the outline of our life together through memory, wondering when comfort had turned into distance and whether I had mistaken familiarity for security. I told myself that I was imagining things, that age made people suspicious, that routine magnified trivial deviations into imagined threats. Yet even as I closed my eyes, a quiet understanding began to take shape within me, not as a conclusion, but as a question that refused to disappear. Something had shifted, not loudly and not all at once, but with the quiet confidence of something that believed it had every right to be there. And as sleep finally took me, I carried with me the unsettling sense that the life I thought I knew so well had already begun to move in directions I had never agreed to follow. I woke to the sensation that the mattress beside me was empty, and for several seconds I remained suspended between sleep and recognition, listening to the unfamiliar openness of the room and the faint whistle of early morning air slipping through the cracked window, until awareness settled heavily into my body and I turned my head toward the pale rectangle of the nightstand where Eloise's phone had rested the night before. Her side of the bed was cool, the blanket folded back with careful intention rather than hurried departure, and somewhere downstairs I could hear the muted clink of ceramic touching wood, a small domestic sound that normally would have reassured me. Yet now it carried a different register, as if the house were staging normality with too much enthusiasm, as if it were performing innocence on our behalf. I dressed slowly, aware of the stiffness in my knees and the mild ache that greeted me most mornings. And as I moved down the hallway, I passed the bathroom where the mirror still held the fading ghost of steam from her shower, a translucent veil dissolving into nothing. The scent of her shampoo lingered in the air, gentle and familiar, and I felt a brief, almost desperate desire to return to the simplicity of the night before, when my suspicions had not yet begun assembling themselves into shape. Eloise stood at the kitchen counter with her back toward me, sunlight spreading across the floor in long winter angles that made every crumb and scratch visible, and she was holding her phone again, cradling it in both hands as though it required protection from gravity. Her shoulders rose and fell in a rhythm that suggested concentration, and when she finally sensed me in the doorway, she turned with a small, startled movement that arrived a fraction too late to be natural. "Morning," she said, placing the device face down beside her coffee mug, and I noticed how deliberately she withdrew her fingers from it, how the separation appeared rehearsed, as though she had practiced looking casual in front of an invisible audience. "Morning," I replied, moving toward the cabinet for a cup, acutely aware of the choreography unfolding between us, the careful avoidance of certain glances, the exaggerated interest in ordinary objects. The coffee tasted slightly burnt, which meant she had been distracted while it brewed, and I watched her lift the mug to her lips, her eyes drifting toward the phone even as she pretended to focus on me. It was a small betrayal of attention, almost tender in its honesty, and I felt something inside my chest tighten in response. Not yet pain, not yet certainty, but the first unmistakable outline of both. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, and her voice carried a politeness that belonged to acquaintances rather than lovers. "Well, enough," I answered, studying the faint color of her cheeks, the brightness that had followed her from the night before into the morning, and I wondered when I had last been responsible for awakening that kind of light in her. We moved through breakfast with the efficiency of long practice, discussing the day ahead, the errands that needed to be run, the minor logistics of two people maintaining a shared existence. Yet beneath every word, I sensed a parallel conversation unfolding in silence, one in which she measured how much I knew, and I tried to calculate how much I was prepared to discover. At one point, the phone lit up again, its glow spilling across the counter like a signal flare, and although I could not read the message from where I stood, I saw the way her breath altered, the way anticipation tightened her posture before she even turned the screen toward herself. The transformation was subtle but undeniable, and it occurred to me with unsettling clarity that I was witnessing the presence of someone else in my marriage without ever seeing his face. I looked away, not out of courtesy, but out of fear, because something in me understood that if I allowed myself to confront the possibility directly, the delicate structure of our life would begin to crumble in ways that could never be reversed. When she left the house an hour later, kissing my cheek with habitual precision, I stood at the window and watched her walk to the car, noticing how she paused before getting in, glancing down at her phone with a softness that resembled relief. And as she drove away, sunlight flashing across the windshield, I felt the quiet, irreversible movement of suspicion settle fully into my bloodstream. The sound of the garage door opening long after midnight pulled me out of shallow, fractured sleep, and as consciousness returned to me in uneven waves, I found myself staring at the red digits of clock with a clarity that felt almost cruel, because the numbers confirmed what my body had already understood. Eloise was not where she had promised she would be. Earlier that evening, she had called to say she might stay out a little longer with her friend from school, her tone breezy yet threaded with something rehearsed, as though she were reading lines from a script written to avoid further questions. And I had responded with what I believed to be generosity, telling her to take her time, to enjoy herself, to reconnect with the past that seemed to nourish her in ways our present no longer could. But generosity, I was beginning to learn, can also be a form of surrender. I listened to the slow roll of the door beneath the bedroom floor, the metallic groan that announced her arrival. And in the space between that sound and the click of the car door closing, my imagination constructed images with ruthless efficiency, offering me pictures I had never asked to see yet could not prevent from forming. I remained on my back, eyes open, palms resting against the sheet, aware of the blood moving through my wrists with a pulse that seemed too loud for the quiet house. Her footsteps entered, hesitant, lighter than usual, as though she hoped to cross the hallway without disturbing the air itself. Eloise's late night return marks a psychological turning point for Philip, as ambiguity shifts into concrete suspicion. The heightened awareness of her altered behavior demonstrates his cognitive and emotional attunement to subtle patterns, reflecting the human tendency to sense inconsistencies before fully acknowledging them. Emotionally, he experiences tension between the habitual trust in his spouse and the instinctual recognition of deceit, revealing the conflict between attachment and self-preservation. This stage illustrates how secrecy can amplify psychological stress in long-term relationships, producing vigilance, rumination, and anticipatory anxiety. Interpersonally, the dynamic highlights the erosion of open communication and the emotional isolation that develops when one partner conceals actions, emphasizing how minor infractions evolve into sustained distrust. When she opened the bedroom door, she did it carefully, allowing only a narrow spill of light from the corridor to touch the carpet, and in that pale slice, I saw her silhouette pause, measuring the situation, determining whether I slept. "I'm awake," I said, because the performance suddenly felt unbearable. She exhaled, a small collapse of tension, and crossed the room, setting her purse down with deliberate softness before sitting at the edge of the bed to remove her shoes. I noticed how long it took her to complete such a simple task, how her fingers lingered on the straps, buying time, organizing thoughts that refused to arrange themselves easily. "I didn't realize how late it had gotten," she murmured, and although she faced away from me, I could hear the apology she hoped the darkness would deliver on her behalf. I pushed myself upright and was immediately aware of a scent that did not belong to our house. Something warm and unfamiliar woven faintly into the fabric of her coat, and I tried, with an effort that bordered on desperation, to assign it an innocent origin, perhaps a crowded cafe or the passing embrace of someone she had not seen in decades. Yet the explanation felt thin even as I constructed it. "Did you have a good time?" I asked, and the question trembled between invitation and interrogation. "Yes," she replied after a pause that lasted half a breath too long. And I heard in that single word an entire landscape of experience for which I had been carefully excluded. She changed in the bathroom, and I watched the line of light beneath the door while water ran briefly in the sink, while drawers opened and closed, while the ordinary mechanics of bedtime unfolded with exaggerated normality, and I felt the peculiar sensation of being a guest in my own life, waiting politely for someone to explain what kind of evening we had just had. When she finally lay beside me, her back turned, I resisted the impulse to reach for her, because touch, I understood, might expose the difference between us more clearly than distance ever could. In the darkness, my mind wandered through the years of our marriage, revisiting vacations, illnesses, birthdays, arguments that had dissolved into compromise, and I wondered whether betrayal always begins long before it becomes visible, whether it germinates quietly in the spaces where conversation fades and curiosity dies, where two people begin to accept each other as permanent rather than precious. Beside me, Eloise's breathing settled into the rhythm of someone pretending to sleep, and I lay there listening to it, aware that imitation can be more exhausting than truth. At some point, her phone vibrated against the wood of the nightstand, a discreet but undeniable tremor, and although she did not move, I felt the awareness pass through her body like electricity. She waited, perhaps hoping I would ignore it, perhaps trusting that I would, and after several seconds the vibration stopped, leaving behind a silence, so complete it seemed to echo. I stared into the dark, my thoughts no longer scattered but slowly aligning themselves toward a possibility I had resisted for weeks, and with a clarity that frightened me. I realized that trust had begun to feel less like virtue and more like blindness. Sleep did not return. Instead, morning approached, patient and unstoppable, carrying with it the promise that whatever lived in the shadows of my marriage would soon demand to be seen. It began with the laptop sitting on the edge of the dining table, its screen dark but quietly insistent, as if it had been waiting for me to return from the kitchen, for me to settle into the familiar chair and allow the ordinary rhythm of the evening to continue. And yet something about its presence felt deliberate, a quiet invitation that my instincts, sharpened now by nights of suspicion, refused to ignore. Eloise had asked me, almost casually, to help her recover some old photos from an account she had not accessed in years, explaining that she wanted to make an album, a tribute to memories that felt more vivid in her imagination than in the reality of our home. And I had agreed, telling myself it was a small, kind gesture, nothing more than an act of routine helpfulness. Yet as I unlocked the device and entered the password she had whispered softly over the phone earlier in the day, the dim light of the screen illuminated the dining room in a cold, precise glow that seemed to highlight every scratch on the wooden surface and every imperfection in the paint on the walls, transforming the familiar into something sharper, more exacting, less forgiving. The inbox opened slowly, the cursor blinking as though counting the seconds until recognition caught up with me. And at first the messages seemed harmless, small notes from old classmates, brief greetings and reminiscences that belonged to the safe categories of nostalgia. I told myself, briefly, that this was exactly what she had said it was, that I was imposing anxiety where none belonged, that years of careful cohabitation and loyalty did not suddenly evaporate over a handful of emails. Then I noticed the pattern. Names I did not recognize intertwined with the familiar, words that carried a different rhythm than the casual chatter of long-lost friends, messages that referenced meetings, plans, rooms, moments that existed entirely outside of our shared life. The first one caught me by its careful phrasing, the way she had written it. "I'll be thinking of you tonight. We'll have to be careful." I blinked at the screen, tasting a metallic dryness in my mouth, feeling the subtle tremor in my hands as I scrolled, as though my body had already understood what my mind was only beginning to accept. Each subsequent message layered upon the previous one, a tapestry of months, perhaps years, carefully preserved, delicately hidden beneath the trivialities of everyday life. The discovery of the emails crystallizes Philip's suspicions into undeniable reality, forcing him to confront betrayal cognitively and emotionally. Psychologically, this event triggers shock, disbelief, and grief, highlighting the impact of hidden relational infidelity on one's sense of safety and reality. The juxtaposition of mundane life with a concealed relationship amplifies the perceived duplicity, intensifying feelings of betrayal and loss. Emotionally, Philip navigates a complex mixture of anger, sadness, and a deep sense of personal exclusion from his spouse's inner world. This moment demonstrates how betrayal shatters the assumed continuity of shared experiences, compelling the individual to reassess the meaning of intimacy, trust, and long-term commitment. It is a pivotal stage where denial is no longer tenable, and cognitive processing must confront both past and present evidence. They spoke in a language I recognized, not from shared experiences, but from the absence of them, the longing, the secrecy, the soft, careful tenderness reserved for someone else. And I realized that the woman who had slept beside me the night before, who had smiled across breakfast and carried herself with practiced normalcy, had been living another life without me, in a parallel world I had no access to and could not imagine. I put my palms against the table, leaning forward, trying to stabilize the swirl of nausea and disbelief that had begun to rise in my chest, And yet I could not stop reading, because even as my heart protested, my curiosity demanded completion, and the need to understand, to witness the truth, overpowered my better judgment. A photograph appeared among the messages, unassuming at first, a casual selfie of her in a cafe, her eyes brighter than I had ever seen, her hand touching the shoulder of a man whose presence on that screen felt like an invasion, a quiet, inexorable claiming of territory I had believed belonged only to us. I closed my eyes briefly, drawing in a breath that trembled in my chest, aware of the kitchen clock ticking behind me, of the refrigerator's steady hum, of the faint aroma of the tea Eloise had left to cool on the counter, and I thought about how long I had been asleep in our marriage, how much of myself I had surrendered to routine and trust, and how the truth, once revealed, possessed a power that could not be undone. By the time I opened my eyes again, the glow of the laptop felt accusatory, as if the screen itself had been waiting, watching, recording my slow recognition of what had always been present, hidden beneath small gestures, forgotten receipts, late-night departures, tiny misalignments in the rhythm of our home. I could hear my own heartbeat, irregular and sharp, echoing in my ears like a drum marking the distance between the life I had imagined and the one that now unrolled before me, precise, undeniable, and irrevocable. I had found proof, not a fleeting slip of the tongue, not a suspicious glance, but concrete, patient, intimate proof that Eloise had been maintaining a secret relationship, one that stretched back months and possibly years. And with it came the sudden, astonishing awareness that the love we had preserved in habit and domestic calm had been quietly inhabited by another presence, a parallel tenderness that had grown in the shadow of my own devotion. The room seemed to close around me as I sat there, staring at the glow of the screen, tasting the faint bitterness of disbelief, imagining the time she had left the house late, the small excuses, the moments she had carried herself in ways I now recognized as practiced concealment. Every detail, every ordinary act that had once reassured me, now seemed colored by subtle duplicity, and I understood, in that awful, magnificent instant, that my life had split quietly, invisibly, along the axis of her hidden choices. And yet, amidst the shock and the ache, there was a strange, inevitable clarity. I could see the trajectory of our marriage as it had really existed, and I knew, without hesitation, that this revelation demanded a reckoning I was no longer capable of postponing. The cafe was quiet in that early afternoon lull, the kind of moment when the world seemed to hold its breath, and yet as I pushed open the door, the bell's cheery ring felt almost accusatory, slicing through the stillness like a signal I had no choice but to heed, because the figures seated at the corner table were immediately visible through the haze of light and faint steam rising from coffee cups. Eloise was there, the sunlight catching her hair in a way that made it glimmer with a warmth I had not seen in years. And across from her sat the man whose name had been whispered through my imagination for weeks, whose presence on the photographs and in messages had invaded the careful borders of my life. His hand rested lightly on hers, not possessively but intimately, and the subtle tilt of their heads toward each other spoke of familiarity, a shared world I had never been allowed to enter. For a long moment, I could not breathe, and then, in a motion that seemed to belong more to muscle memory than conscious decision, I crossed the threshold, my shoes scuffing softly against the worn wood floor, my gaze fixed on the curve of her back and the tilt of his head, and I felt the house we had built over 24 years collapse inside me, brick by brick without a sound. She looked up first, the expression on her face, transforming in the instant recognition, met the reality she had long anticipated, and the flush that rose along her neck and cheeks was a mix of fear, sorrow, and the faint, unshakable echo of desire, all of it coiled into the careful posture she now adopted. As though the air itself demanded, she maintained some grace in the face of exposure. The face-to-face confrontation in the cafe represents the culmination of psychological tension and the transition from internal speculation to external reality. Here, Philip experiences immediate emotional intensity, shock, betrayal, and the necessity of moral and emotional response. Psychologically, witnessing the intimacy he was excluded from forces him to to integrate both cognitive understanding and visceral reaction, challenging his prior assumptions about relational safety. Emotionally, it confronts him with the tangible presence of the other party, making abstract suspicion real and unavoidable. Interpersonally, the encounter demonstrates the role of acknowledgement and confrontation in processing betrayal. Both partners are forced to recognize the consequences of secrecy and their impacts on trust, setting the stage for personal boundaries and eventual resolution. "Philip," she breathed, her voice carrying across the narrow space of the cafe. And though it sounded gentle, it was laden with a gravity I had never heard before. The weight of someone who knows that the world she has lived in secretly has finally collided with the world she once shared with you. I did not sit. I could not. The chair beside her remained uninviting, almost ceremonial, and I let my hands rest lightly against the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my fingertips with a sharp awareness that contrasted violently with the calm of the room. I read the emails. I said quietly, deliberately, and the words fell into the air like stones dropped into water, disturbing everything around them without a single splash. Gabriel, the man whose presence had so subtly infiltrated our home and our lives, drew his hand back, a slow retreat that spoke of both fear and respect. And for the first time, I saw him not as a rival, but as someone who belonged to a story in which I had been absent since the beginning. His eyes met mine briefly, wide and unsteady, and in them I detected a recognition of my silence, my patience, and the restrained fury that had taken decades to accumulate. Eloise's hands twisted together in her lap, fingers entwining in a gesture that reminded me of a child attempting to steady herself in a storm, and she spoke again, voice low, careful. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't want it to be like this." I nodded slowly, feeling the odd mixture of relief and devastation that comes when the truth, however cruel, is finally visible. "I understand," I said, and the words were not forgiveness, nor accusation, but the quiet acknowledgement that love, once fractured, cannot always be reconstructed from fragments, no matter how carefully one tries. We spoke then, softly, in the kind of pauses and silences that carried more meaning than words ever could, tracing the outlines of decisions made long before this moment, the invisible paths that had led us here, the choices each of us had made in private and secrecy. Eloise tried to explain, her eyes pleading, her voice steadying with honesty rather than artifice, and I listened, aware that every syllable, every hesitation, was both confession and farewell. I realized, with a startling clarity, that I could control only myself, my actions, my response, and that to remain trapped in anger or despair would be to give her betrayal power it did not deserve. The weight of decades pressed against me, the texture of shared life, the scent of familiarity, and yet in that very heaviness, I felt the first flicker of release, a fragile recognition that I could step forward unbroken, even as the foundations beneath me shifted irrevocably. Finally, I stood, slowly, deliberately, feeling the grain of the floor beneath my feet, the slight tremor in my muscles, the rush of air from the open windows carrying the faint scent of roasted coffee and wet asphalt, and I said only what I knew to be true. "I cannot compete with your past, Eloise, and I will not try. I hope you are happy, but I will not live beside what has grown in secret." She gasped softly, a sound almost swallowed by the quiet of the room, and I could see the understanding pass across her face, a mixture of sorrow, relief, and acceptance, the same combination that I now carried with me as I walked out of the cafe, out of the life I believed permanent, and into a world that demanded I learn again what it meant to exist solely for myself. The door swung shut behind me, the bells chime ringing differently than before. Not cheerful, not trivial, but solemn, marking the passage from one chapter to the next, a signal that the course of my life had irrevocably altered, and that the clarity I now possessed was both terrifying and liberating. The morning air had a sharp clarity, the kind that makes each inhalation feel like an assertion of life itself. And as I stood by the window watching the first rays of sunlight cut across the garden, I realized with a strange, almost startling serenity that the house, the rooms, the objects we had accumulated over decades were no longer markers of shared permanence, but instruments of my own renewal, if I was willing to take them as such. The sofa, with its faint indentations from evenings spent side by side, the coffee table scuffed with careless accidents, the kitchen counters lined with jars and tins in neat, familiar order, all of it now existed within a space where I alone determined meaning, and the realization brought with it both the ache of absence and the quiet thrill of possibility. Eloise had left some hours earlier, her belongings partially packed, the soft scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway, as if she had chosen to leave behind an echo rather than a presence. And I moved through the apartment carefully, noting how the sunlight caught the brass handle of the front door, how the floorboard in the corridor groaned beneath my weight, how the faint hum of the refrigerator punctuated the silence like a heartbeat. Every sound, every shift in light, seemed suddenly more vivid, more precise, because it was now entirely under my awareness, unmediated by the subtle tensions of shared life or by the invisible watchfulness I had once extended toward her movements. I paused in the bedroom doorway, tracing with my eyes the familiar line of the bedspread, the pillows arranged in the habitual corners that had once served as markers of our routine, and I noticed, with a mixture of sorrow and clarity, that I no longer needed to measure my own breathing against hers, no longer needed to navigate the complex choreography of proximity and distance that had defined so much of our adult existence. The freedom was not loud or triumphant. It was the quiet kind that presses against the skin, entering slowly, reshaping thought patterns and perceptions, a subtle rearrangement of the interior landscape I had assumed would remain fixed for the rest of my life. I moved through the apartment like a man learning the contours of a body he had lived in for decades, but had never fully claimed, touching the worn edges of tables, feeling the grain of the wooden floor beneath my feet, listening to the small, ordinary sounds of my own presence, and realizing that they were now entirely my own. Each action, the turning of a knob, the pouring of tea, the slow brushing of fingers along the spines of books on a shelf, carried an intentionality I had not permitted myself before, a gentle, tactile assertion that my life could continue without betrayal defining it. Outside, the city hummed quietly with the beginnings of the day, cars moving in measured waves along streets slicked with dew, the faint scent of wet concrete mixing with exhaust, and I breathed it in fully, feeling my chest expand with a rhythm unshared and unmonitored, the physicality of liberation grounding the abstract, painful revelations that had led me to this moment. I understood, without rancor or anger, that the person I had loved had chosen another life, and that her choices belonged to her alone, but that I, too, had a right to claim the world as it existed outside her secret, outside the confines of shared expectation, in which my agency had been quietly diminished. I began packing small items into a box, not with haste or resentment, but with a slow, deliberate awareness that each object returned to its place in a life I would now inhabit independently, a life in which I could determine what mattered, what remained, and what was better left behind. The weight of the box was comforting in its tangibility, a contrast to the abstract, ghostly burden of emotional betrayal. And as I lifted it, feeling the strain in my arms and shoulders, I realized that for the first time in decades, I had an unmediated sense of responsibility to myself, unencumbered by the invisible architecture of someone else's desires. I paused by the front door, listening to the faint rustle of leaves in the courtyard below, feeling the temperature of the air on my skin, noting the way the light shifted with each passing second, and I understood fully that boundaries were not drawn in anger, not in confrontation, but in the quiet, deliberate decision to occupy the space I had once ceded, to walk through a life that was mine to shape. This moment represents Philip's conscious psychological choice to assert boundaries and reclaim agency over his life. Emotionally, he experiences a blend of sorrow, clarity, and relief as he internalizes the necessity of separation without allowing anger or vengeance to dominate. Cognitively, he is engaging in reflective processing, evaluating the meaning of trust, betrayal, and autonomy, and reconstructing his identity independent of the relational transgression. The attention to sensory details, light, air, physical surroundings, reflects mindfulness and grounding, crucial for coping with relational trauma. Interpersonally, this decision signals mature conflict resolution, illustrating that personal growth often emerges not from retribution, but from conscious self-preservation, acceptance of limitations in others, and the establishment of new relational boundaries. My hands rested against the doorframe, muscles steady, heartbeat settling into a rhythm of clarity rather than tension. And in that stillness, I experienced the first fleeting sense of what it would mean to move forward without carrying the weight of betrayal as a personal identity. I opened the door, stepping outside into the light that now felt warmer, more immediate, more honest than I had ever permitted myself to notice. And as the city began to stir in earnest, I inhaled deeply, feeling the cool morning air fill my lungs, appreciating the simplicity of the physical world, the tactile certainty of wind against skin, concrete beneath shoes, and the distant, inconsequential hum of life continuing beyond personal grief. I felt both vulnerable and strong, small and infinite, aware that the process of rebuilding would be gradual, layered, but inevitable, and that in this quiet assertion of self, I had taken the first deliberate step toward freedom. Philip's emergence into the morning light symbolizes psychological and emotional liberation. Here, the focus shifts from loss to personal empowerment, highlighting resilience in the aftermath of betrayal. Cognitively, he recognizes the independence of his own life and the ability to reconstruct meaning outside of the marriage. Emotionally, the sensory immersion in air, light, and city sounds anchors him in the present, allowing him to move from grief and shock toward hope and agency. Interpersonally, this phase illustrates the potential for growth after relational trauma. Rather than being defined by betrayal, the individual uses the experience as a catalyst for self-discovery, renewed boundaries, and intentional engagement with the world. This stage emphasizes that autonomy and internal clarity are the ultimate outcomes of facing and processing infidelity. Across the narrative, the story illustrates the profound psychological impact of long-term relational betrayal of trust, self-perception, and emotional regulation. Philip's journey progresses from subtle suspicion and denial through shock, confrontation, and finally to conscious boundary setting and self-empowerment. Each stage demonstrates key emotional dynamics: hypervigilance in response to minor inconsistencies, cognitive dissonance when faced with evidence, the visceral intensity of direct exposure, and the gradual reconstruction of identity in response to loss. Psychologically, the narrative emphasizes that trust, once broken, requires not only acknowledgement of the betrayal, but also deliberate personal action to reclaim autonomy. Emotionally, Philip's growth reflects resilience, mindfulness, and reflective processing, highlighting the potential for personal evolution even after profound relational rupture. Interpersonally, the story underscores that mature responses to betrayal involve setting boundaries, accepting the limitations of others, and cultivating independence, transforming trauma into a platform for self-realization and empowerment.